All across the globe, cemeteries and historic buildings are disappearing. The histories and names of those buried there and who lived there are in threat of being lost forever. I am on a mission to tell their stories. This is Grave Hunter. Hey creeps and grave hunters. These are weird times, let's just be honest, and I wish I could report on this pandemic from some cool location, but instead we're gonna have to make do with my saver at home quarantine edition location, which is my bedroom. And I know I have recorded videos here in the past, but this feels different because I don't have a choice. If I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I've been having a really hard time wanting to create content ever since the coronavirus pandemic has hit. Okay, I'm gonna pause really quick because I know everybody is avoiding saying the word coronavirus or COVID-19 or pandemic because YouTube demonetizes videos that use those words. So I'm going to use it because I am not going to censor what's actually happening. I think personally, it's because it's hard to find light in the macabre when people are dying every day. Like, I don't want to talk about death when people are literally dying every day and I'm watching a death toll rise. But then I heard about how New York City is once again utilizing Hart Island for mass burials for infectious diseases. And that gave me the energy to put makeup on and actually create a video for you guys. But I apologize in advance if this video isn't as upbeat as others, because this time I'm not just reporting on something in the past, I'm reporting about something in the present. And I gotta be honest, living through history is scary. So grab a glass of whatever is getting you through this wine for me always, and join me in my pandemic roots. You can see these little pretty puppies as we dive into the past and present history of Hart Island. Chin chin. I think we all have this romantic type vision of what a potter's field is as like this historic turn of the century thing where the indigent and the societal lepers go, but we forget that the unidentified and the poor still need a place to be buried in this day and age, i.e. a freaking potter's field. And Hart Island in New York has been that for over a century, but the history of this island and how it came to be a giant cemetery is really interesting. So Hart Island originally was the ancestral land of the Seminole. In 1654, a treaty was signed by the chief, a man named Wampage? I know I butchered that, I'm sorry, but he would later change his name to Anhook after he led the famous massacre on the Hutchinsons and personally slayed Anne Hutchinson, who was a famous Puritan spiritual leader. Her story's crazy, we're not gonna get into it, but it's crazy. But anyways, apparently, it was tradition to rename yourself after your most famous victim. Now, whether he wanted the treaty or his hand was forced, I have no idea. I'm assuming it was forced.
You have taken the land which is rightfully ours.
But anyways, he sold it to a doctor by the name of Thomas Pell, and Pell now owned most of the land, or all of the land actually, and he was just one of, tons of white men that over the centuries would own Hart Island. Now, did a family named Hart ever own the island? Nah, that's not why it's called Hart Island. Actually, the reason why it's called Hart Island is a kind of a hot topic, which I think is so strange. But the most likely explanation is that it was named for the Middle English word for stag, which is hart, referring to all the wild deer and game that was on the island, which is why it was popular for hunting. Cool, great, whatever. Now for deaths. Now, we don't have any documented deaths on the island until the 1800s, but considering this was Native American land for centuries, you could safely assume that there was some burials there that we don't know about. The first non-residential use of the land came during the Civil War, when the federal government temporarily leased the island in 1864 to train their 31st Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. Then in 1865, they built a giant barracks to house all of the Confederate prisoners of war, which I don't know why it's exciting to me, but it's kind of spicy. And during the 4 months of use, 3,413 prisoners were captured, which is a lot for a very short period of time. And you can just imagine the conditions the prisoners were kept in. And during the occupation, the 4 months, over 235 POWs died and were buried on the island. If I'm just gonna be honest, I find a lot of enjoyment in the anger a lot of those Confederate soldiers probably felt being in prison and like looking out windows at free roaming Black soldiers. The irony, and I love it. I love it, I love it, I love it. Two different waves of disinterments, one in 1916 and another one in 1941, saw the relocations of these bodies to different veteran cemeteries off of the island because if you're familiar with American history, veterans always get to be in military cemetery. It's like a law or something. It's very important. In 1868, the state of New York Department of Charities and Corrections bought the majority of the island from the Hunter family for $75,000. And that's a ton of money for back then. The reason for the purchase was to build a workshop to house the older boys from the House of Refuge on Randall's Island. Now, the House of Refuge of New York, with its many sites, because they had a lot of different locations, will become the template kind of for reformatories across the nation, and it has been dubbed since the greatest reform school in the world. But people like Charles Dickens, who famously lived and worked in a workhouse when he was a young lad in London,
"Please, sir, I want some more,"
even came and toured the facility. Like, these were kind of a big deal. And the idea behind the House of Refuge was to take in children that would often land in a proper prison because the system back then was very different. And they just committed things like vagrancy or petty theft. So they basically brought them in, put them to work while giving them kind of an education that was completely founded in Protestant studies. And it's not until the later half of the 1800s did they start separating the boys and girls, but their work across the entire time was always different. Boys would typically produce chairs, nails, brushes, while the girls performed domestic tasks like laundry and cooking, because that's what women do best, right? Unlike a prison though, if you were in the House of Refuge, they could keep you until you were an adult. Oh, and they could also basically rent you out as an indentured servant. That's great. You guys are smart enough, so I'm sure you're picturing a somewhat hellish life despite all of this, right? Well, you'd be right. Between the corporal punishment, the religious intolerance, the angry children lashing out against guards, which there's multiple accounts of, the state eventually stepped in. And in 1870, they tried to make things less terrible? I read one archive from 1904 celebrating the renovations to the workhouse's kitchen and laundry, making it less dismal. How bad was it? The House of Refuge may have been an example of exemplary reform, but like all other versions, it came with the cost. The workhouse was accompanied with a decommissioned commercial ship called the Mercury that was brought to the island, and it became a short-lived program called the Mercury School, where boys could learn nautical things like navigation and whatever, water shit. But in 1873, 2 boys, a part of the program, drowned. And the first memorial was erected on the island for the boys. Keep in mind, this is not the first burial. This is the 1870s, but it is the first memorial. So things start getting really interesting after the Civil War because you have this influx of unidentified bodies. And the U.S. Sanitary Commission adopted a practice started during the war where they took photos of unknown bodies. And they set up the first municipal morgue in North America at New York's famous Bellevue Hospital, which is full of so much great history, but that's a whole other episode. And they took on the crazy task of trying to document, examine, and identify the dead, which is, I can't even imagine how stressful that job must have been. And you have to imagine, much like San Francisco, there is very little excess space in New York City proper, which means burial grounds are prized property, usually reserved for the wealthy and identified. Basically, there was no longer space for all these new dead bodies. So in 1866, the city took a stand and passed an ordinance prohibiting any new burial grounds in New York City from opening. The lonely dead would have to be laid to rest elsewhere. Now, there was already one potter's field being used over on Ward's Island since the 1840s, but they decided to close that as well. And I couldn't find in the archives anything stating why they closed it, so I'm assuming it just must have been too full. Upshot, the city needed a new place for the bodies. So in 1869, 45 acres of the northern tip of Hart Island was designated for a potter's field for the city of New York. Thus, City Cemetery is born. Here's the interesting thing though. So they have all these dead people and they have photos of all of them, and obviously keeping all the bodies in the morgue, waiting for them to be identified, wasn't practical. So they decided to put the bodies they believe would be claimed at some point in individual graves on Hart Island, and the ones they kind of assumed probably wouldn't be into a mass common trench. Basically, the way it worked was a family member could go to Bellevue, poke around the photos. If they recognized anybody, like, hey, that's my brother. Hey, can I have his remains returned? That was kind of easy if it was in a grave that was individual, but if it wasn't, they were having to trudge around in a bunch of mass graves looking for this one body. So to fix this issue of rummaging through corpses, in 1872, they rolled out a grid system much like the system they used during the Civil War battlefields, where each grave is marked and numbered, allowing for easy retrieval of a body. Talk about ingenious! And this system is still used to this day. The only difference is now they use a GPS system and stone markers because all the wood ones burned in the early 20th century. Oops. I want to digress for just a moment to kind of talk about these islands. Besides Hart, you have these other little guys that have crazy histories too. Rikers Island, Randall Island, Ward Island, and Roosevelt all had their own horrors. There is a chain of islands housing various versions of society's unwanted. So I'd like to read you an excerpt from a scientific journal published in 1886 that describes these islands. I think the vocabulary used paints an important picture into the way these places were viewed by higher society, and I also believe it's the perfect segue into learning more about Hart Island in the present. Blackwell's nearly 2 mile long, flushed by 2 swift channels of the river it divides, full 90 acres in extent, studded from end to end with the epileptic, paralytic, maternity, and charity hospitals. The New York Penitentiary spreading athwart well nigh from shore to shore, the almshouse, the workhouse, and the women's lunatic asylum, and its growing population of more than 7,000. The Ward's Island, lying in a nearly rectangular area of 260 acres at the junction of Harlem and East River at Hell's Gate. Here are the lunatic asylum for males and the homeopathic hospital, together having about 3,000 inmates. Immediately north and separated by Little Hellgate, some 200 feet wide, is Randall's Island, a shield-shaped area of 160 acres, and with wards lying close to the city. Here are the infants and Randall's Island hospitals, an asylum for idiots, a branch of the penitentiary, an insane asylum for the young, and the House of Refuge. Advancing a mile, we find Rikers Island for the exclusive use of correctional institutions, a fair domain of 60 acres. And yet, farther up the sound, some 17 miles from the city, the advanced post of this ever-growing colonization, with its area of some 50 acres. Its hospital for the incurables, and branch workhouse and lunatic asylum, nearly 3,500 inmates. And the ghastly halting place of all this interminable procession, Potter's Field, with its myriads of friendless, dishonored dead, we reach and stop at Hart Island. What a journey, am I right? And I'm ashamed to say that the history of most of these islands has kind of been lost to me until the Hart Island made the news recently. Truthfully, I couldn't ask for a more appropriate location to feature right now. I'm actually writing a book on pandemics, and this island has been home to many infected by deadly diseases and the burial place of thousands more. In fact, the first known person to be buried on the island once it was being used as a cemetery was a 24-year-old woman named Louisa Van Slyke, who died of tuberculosis all by herself at Charity Hospital. Honestly, I really hope to be able to visit the island one day and do a proper episode of Grave Hunter, because I'm sure the stories of the people buried there are deeply and endlessly fascinating. Like, just because they were poor or unidentified doesn't mean that their stories aren't important. I can't find the exact date of the bill, but there would eventually be a hospital built on the island to solely treat those suffering from tuberculosis and other chronic illnesses. This building would be used throughout the 20th century. It would become a rehabilitation house for homeless males with addiction issues, and then later a rehabilitation prison type place for criminals with drug issues. In the 1870s, a portion of the southern tip of the island would be used to quarantine those suffering from yellow fever, and in the 1980s, on the southern tip of the island as well, 16 burials of victims that died of AIDS would be laid to rest. The island has many connections to infectious diseases. For those of us that love a good creepy location, we can really look no further than the only 19th century building left surviving on the island, which they call the Pavilion, but we would know it better as the Insane Asylum. The structure was built in the 1860s in an ongoing effort to expand reform-oriented penal institutions, and there was no better place to do that than on Hart Island, where there were already ample prisons and graveyards. Oh yeah, that was a thing. You wanted to make sure prisons and asylums were next to burial sites because, well, people had a tendency to die there. So let's talk about prisons and the prisoners, because they are integral parts of the island's current life and its history. So you have all these Civil War barracks that are left on the island, and they decided to turn them into prisons. And a decision was made to make them a little bit less awful. Like, they didn't want them to be like Blackwell's. They wanted them to be a little bit more about rehabilitation, so they left bars off the windows. And instead, these inmates could learn trades and be responsible for burying the dead. In 1904, a decision was made to move the younger boys aged 16 to 30 from the main prison into separate structures, a reformatory for misdemeanants, they called it, which misdemeanants is officially my new favorite word. And those structures consisted of buildings that included things like a smokehouse, a laundry, and a butcher. And I'm sure there was a reason why they felt a need to separate the young boys from the older men, but I would rather not think about that. Point is, there was a lot of places to be kept prisoner on Hart Island. The prisons were open until 1966, and then they moved the prisoners mainly over to Rikers Island. There was a brief movement where they wanted to re-prison people, but they lost that battle, and in 1985, they tore down the prisons to make way for more burial grounds. But the tradition of prisoners burying the dead hasn't stopped since its inception. Prisoners to this day are still ferried in from Rikers Island, and they land on the same ferry dock that back in the day family members would come to, the little morgue that was there to reclaim the bodies of their loved ones. In fact, it was the prisoners who requested to build the Peace Memorial in 1948 to commemorate all the dead in World War II, which the island was associated with. So during the island, the war was used.
Okay, yeah, I definitely meant to say during the war, the island was used. Please keep in mind, I was drinking a lot of wine.
As a disciplinary center for Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine personnel.
I'm gonna shoot you myself, you goddamn fucking bastard. Get him out of here!
This is kind of spicy. They even had a few German POWs when a U-boat popped up on Long Island's shore, which is kind of awesome, actually. But the military connection doesn't end there, because in the 1950s, and this is pretty jazzy, the Army set up anti-aircraft missile defense base on the island called Nike Missile NY-15 Launch Area. This weapon was not a joke, and the launch base and the underground magazine storage was pretty badass. Sadly, everything now is concreted over, but it's still kind of rad. I'm also really intrigued with how this island has handled different religions and races. After the Native Americans, the island was pretty much strictly Protestant for everybody that was running it. But later, as more burials surfaced, different religious symbols and monuments were erected to be a little bit more inclusive. The prison even built a Catholic chapel on the island, which still stands, by the way, even though the Catholic Church reclaimed the stained glass window and vandals stole the bell. Anyways, win some, lose some. Also, in the 20s, a millionaire named Solomon Riley, who made his money developing Harlem, bought 4 acres, the last 4 acres of the southern tip of the island, from the last remaining Hunter family member that lived on the island. And he bought it with the hopes to build an amusement park for the Black community, since they weren't allowed in the parks that existed. The plan was to build a place that would rival Coney Island. But sadly, of course, when the city heard of the plan that Riley had to have 60 motorboats that would ferry passengers to the island, they seized the land, they condemned it because they were worried that all these boats would lead to prison escapes and prohibition, alcohol smuggling, and all this crazy thing. So they bought it, they seized it, they kiboshed the whole plan and turned it into a sewage facility plant. And then in the 80s, when that was all over, that's where they buried the 16 AIDS victims. And I could make a lot of speculations and say a lot of things about this, but I'm just gonna scoot on past. This brings us to today and our current coronavirus pandemic and how New York has become the hardest hit in our country. Once again, the island that is home to over 1 million burials is being asked to provide a place for the infected dead. Drone footage of prisoners in hazmat suits lowering pine wood caskets into open trenches swarmed the internet last week. And people were yelling, the mass graves are here. And it's like, of course they are. We all knew this was gonna happen, right? Like, this is a pandemic. People die, this happens, it's awful. They are burying the unfortunate victims of COVID-19 the same way they bury everyone. 3 caskets deep in a large trench that will be mapped out and labeled as all others are. In 50 years, if some of those bodies remain because they were never claimed, the trenches will be reused, just like they've been reused since 1931. The reality is, some people may not be able to relocate the bodies of their loved ones to another cemetery at a later date because they won't be able to afford it. Others will remain because they were all alone. We are witnessing the island doing what it does best: provide a waiting ground for those few that will one day get to go home to a funeral and to loved ones, but more commonly be the forever ground of those who have no one, who society forgot, and whose families don't have the means to provide anything different. Thankfully, people can now request to come visit graves after a group of mothers in 2013 jumped through hoops in order to go visit the graves of their babies. Listen, I want to be able to tie this all up in a bow or some little quip, but I can't. It's just sad and unfortunate, and the history of the island is equally sad. But I feel it's important we talk about what's going on Hart Island and we discuss the various other ways the world is handling their influx of the dead. All I can leave you with is my love and my best wishes and my sincere hope you are staying safe and sane during a time and event that none of us at all were prepared for. I certainly wasn't. I don't know how anybody could prepare mentally for this. History has taught us that we will get through this. It's going to require sacrifice, staying at home longer than we want, but we also have to read from history's book and remember that pandemics come in waves, not one shot. There will be a resurgence. I hate to say it, but there will be, and we need to do what we can now. So hopefully, when the inevitable next wave hits, there will be less graves dug on Hart Island. I love you guys. Stay safe.